Next up, we're going to have somebody that really understands sacrifice. I mean, we're asking you guys to sacrifice some of your time and energy and maybe even your money. We know the state that lawsuits have cost a lot of money and they're going to cost a lot more. But I want to introduce one of my heroes, Jeanette Finnecum.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Woody and Kelly, for having me at your home and for inviting me here. Okay, I'm going to struggle with technology up here just a little bit. Let's hope it stays put on this podium. I'm very grateful to be here, to be able to share part of my story and my experiences with all of you. I am Lavoy Finnecum's wife, widow. And I do and have been traveling around the country for the last 4 years for multiple different reasons. I wanted to preserve and protect his legacy. I want accountability for his murder, his assassination. I want to see reform. And my husband, he was an educator in a sense, not for the state, but he studied and he wanted to teach about the Constitution, about our liberty, about our freedoms, and he wrote his book. And that was his way, along with teaching our children and all of the children that came into our home good things and about our country and how to be a good citizen, how to be a good son and daughter, how to be a good person in today's world. And so I wanted to continue with those things. And so that has been my motivation to keep going, to bring to you who Lavoy really was. I've had many, many challenges, to say the least. Over the last 4 years, I've been through quite a bit. Mark keeps telling me I need to write a book, and maybe someday, if I ever stop, I might. Because some of the stories are amazing. Some of them are horrific, very challenging, but I think that they could help in some way to different situations for each one of you. Some of the things that I went through right at the very beginning, I had challenges with the BLM. My husband was in good standing. He was paid up with all of his fees. However, he had made a statement that he was no longer going to sign his grazing contracts with the BLM, and so that's where it all began. And if you stay to the end of today's program, you will be able to see episode 1 of Lavoy Dead Men Talking, where you will hear Lavoy explain to you himself what he was doing and why he was doing it. I believe we're going to be close by and showing episode 3 tomorrow night over at Terry's place. So my challenges began with the BLM. After they murdered my husband, they didn't want to recognize that I was his heir and that I owned that property, that lease. They didn't want me to continue to run my cows, and so they continued to harass and threaten and ultimately forced me off my range, pretty much just shy of gunpoint, just shy of it. I had good people all across this country, and maybe some of you, who sent hay for my cows that I had to put in a 5-acre pen, which, you know, when they're used to roaming 3 mountains, that's not very much room. So thank you if you're any of those individuals who sent me hay to keep my cows alive for the 5 to 8 months that I had them in that pen. Those challenges continued with the BLM, even though I had hired an attorney. They didn't want to speak to my attorney. They didn't want to answer our emails or phone calls, nothing. It wasn't until President Trump was elected that I saw any relief in that area. and he had appointed Ryan Zinke, head of Interior. And at that point, it was November of 2017 that I get this phone call out of the blue, and it is the attorneys for the BLM, and they're saying, well, hey, we want to meet with you. And we're going, whoa, who's our fairy godmother? They're finally responding to us in one way. And so we did. We went into the Salt Lake Federal Building where we had to meet with all of their attorneys, and we met with them, and they were willing to settle, and they were willing to dismiss most of the fines that they had assessed me, which was over $20,000, and allow me to go ahead and continue my operation. And I was really relieved that we were finally getting some move in this whole process, because it had been nearly 2 years at that point that they had forced me off my land, and they were refusing to deal with me. At one point they said to me, Mrs. Finnecum, you can sell your lease, but you're never going to get your cows back on. You see, they weren't done making an example out of our family to the American people. They wanted to make sure that nobody else had the guts or the courage to stand up against them again. So if they murdered Lavoy and broke and put out of business his wife and his widow, then that would set the tone for the rest of you, right? Wouldn't you just stay in your place because you don't want to lose your livelihood or your way of life? Because it was more of a way of life for us than it was a livelihood. It was something that we could pass on to our children, the work ethic, the fun that you have in ranching. So after I had gone through the 5-page settlement agreement with a fine-tooth comb, and I argued out all my points, I went ahead and settled with the federal government, and I was able to put my cows back on my range. There was still one little piece. You see, this is something, I'll just back up a little bit. We're talking about regulations and government. It's interesting how these different agencies, the BLM in particular, and IRS, all of them, they can sit and write regulation in-house. It's not voted on by we the people. They write the rules and regulations, which we have to follow. But it's interesting in my case that they chose which regulations they were going to enforce and which ones they were not. Which ones they were going to allow me to tap into and which ones I could not, because they had a regulation of their own making that stated that in the event of a permittee dying, that the heirs had 2 years to go through the permitting process. When my lawyers were arguing this point for me and on behalf of me, they said, we're not going to use that for Mrs. Finnecum. She can sell it, but she will never put her cows back on. So they get to decide for us what we get to do and what laws. But thank goodness for Trump. Thank goodness for the change. Because it made all the difference in the world that we elected Trump. It made all the difference in the world. So there was this issue, and you'll see in episode 1 tonight, my husband talks about the water issue. They sent him a letter out of the blue stating that you no longer own 50% of your water. You own 50% of 7 months, because we're only going to allow you to have it as winter range. Therefore, you only own 50% of that spring for 7 months of the year instead of 12. My husband's going, no. No, I own 50% of 12 months of that spring. And so when I applied for my own application, they tried to put that language in my application stating I only own 50% of 7 months. And I refused to sign it, so there was my next battle with the BLM. And I had to go to task with them again. And finally they relented, and they changed the language, and I was able to sign the contract. And I won the stand on my water rights. There's been many, many other stories of different battles that I've had to go through, and I won't bore you with all of them. But I'm grateful for these small victories that I've had with the BLM. I am now operating with my cows on my range, and in fact, it was just recently that we loaded up my last year calves and took them to the auction. And isn't that the funnest part? Go to the auction. That's my funnest part. And in about a month, I get to go up into the mountains, and we did a little cowboy experience to help raise some funds for the legal battle that I'm in with the federal government. And we have some people coming from all over the country that have won the drawing. And we're going to round up our cows again and brand all the new little calves that have come and spend 2 or 3 days up in the hills with these individuals that have come to share this experience with me. So I'm excited for next month, because that's another fun part of ranching is doing all of that and getting on horse and being in the elements, being close to God, because he certainly is there. I feel him there every time that I'm out. And I know why Lavoy loved it so much. It's so peaceful out on horseback. Nobody to bug you too much. And cell phones don't work very good out there. I spent some time in 2018 at the trial for the FBI agent who was indicted with 3 counts of lying and 2 counts of obstructing justice in reference to the murder of my husband. He was one of the agents there at the kill stop. And what's interesting about this particular trial is that Billy Williams, the Attorney General, gives a news statement about this officer, agent, being indicted by the grand jury. And he says, now I want you to remember that this agent who has been charged by the grand jury is innocent until found guilty. And I thought to myself, wow, he's standing up there reminding everybody, thumping the pulpit, telling us to remember that this officer is innocent until proven guilty, but they did not afford that same due process in the case of my husband, who had not even so much as a speeding ticket his entire life. There were no warrants for his arrest that day. He was fired upon 6 times before he got out of the truck, where he was then murdered with his hands in the air. No due process. They found him guilty. They tried him there on that snowy road. They determined his innocence or guilt with no trial by a jury. And I just found that sickening to listen to him spout those words when they're not willing to apply that same process to each American. As we've been going through this process, one court battle after another, you had the Oregon trial where all of the individuals who were arrested the same day that my husband was murdered were found not guilty by a jury of their peers. And then they were extradited down to Nevada, where they were again, the following year, found the case was dismissed with prejudice because of the Brady violations, for the lawlessness of the FBI, the BLM law enforcement, and the prosecution. There is so much for you guys to know about the lawlessness on every level of government. It's unbelievable. And I wish I had hours to sit here and tell you story after story, but it is, I know Mark's going to be working on a documentary in reference to the trials, and I say stay tuned so that you can see what happens in our court systems today. And I think Mark very touched lightly on it, because I'm going through the same thing. It is quite the thing, and if we're to use the system in which we have to be out there actively engaged in trying to correct the mess that we've put ourselves in, like he was talking about. But in reference to Astorita's trial, Obama's administration, their goal was, when he got into office, was to acquire more public lands. And they began that campaign back in 2009 at Bears Ears down in Utah. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Bears Ears Monument. Well, there was a Dr. Red who lived in that little town. And Dan Love, head of BLM law enforcement, and Greg Bretzing, head of FBI in the Western Division, they took charge over that particular raid of Dr. Red's home over a little Indian bead. They had undercover agents that had been working in that town, creating and stirring up fear in the hearts of the people there. And the doctor, after, the SWAT team landed on his house and had snipers all over, he was in such fear that the very next day he committed suicide over a bead. He didn't want to put his family through the hell that he foresaw. The undercover agent that worked on that case also committed suicide because he couldn't live with the fact that Dr. Red had killed himself over what lies he had told the federal government and the conspiracy in which the government was operating under in reference to that particular raid. In 2014, that same team, that duo of Dan Love, BLM law enforcement officer, and Greg Bretzing, head of FBI, also worked as a team in the Bundy incident in Nevada. And in that particular incident, we found later in the Nevada trial in 2018, so I'm going to jump back and forth, but we don't find these things out until later. There was a gentleman named Larry Wooten. He was a BLM law enforcement investigator tasked with investigating the BLM law enforcement itself. I know that's complicated. But he knew they had suspected all this lawlessness, so they were going to do an internal investigation. And so he comes across all of this information and he starts reporting it to his superiors. And his superiors are pressing it under the rug, saying, don't ask, don't tell. It's the good old boy system. We're not going to rock the boat. So nothing goes any further until he is disgusted and he continues to report it from one agency to another. And finally, they see him as a liability. So they raid his office. They strip his office of his computer and all of his personal things. They go to his home and they take all of his information and documents and computers out of his home. They pretty much render him useless, but he sees what's happening to the Bundys in 218 in Nevada. And he says, I can't, in all good conscience, I can't allow these people to go to jail. I'm going to write a letter. And so he wrote a 14-page whistleblower letter and posted it online. And so you're welcome to go there to read it. And so in that letter, information is revealed and we start to find out a lot of things, and we start to do more digging in that trial in Nevada, and that's where the trial is dismissed with prejudice with all of the Brady violations that they bring forth. But one of the things is a falsified threat assessment. In 2012, when the BLM was investigating the Bundys down in Nevada, they did an assessment on the Bundy family and found that they were not a threat and would not pose a threat to law enforcement. But after losing in 2014, and I say losing because Dan Love was hell-bent on taking the Bundys, all the cattle that they had, and wiping their ranch out. And when that didn't happen, why did that not happen? Because the sheriff had the guts to stand between the BLM and the Bundy family and said, you're not going to do this. And so they had to back down. Well, he was so upset about that in 2016, when they stood in Oregon for the Hammond family, he falsified the threat assessment to where it read that the Bundys were a threat to law enforcement and named my husband, Lavoy Finnecum, as the #1 threat, and turned it over to the FBI agent in charge, his friend, Greg Bretzing, who was in charge of the Oregon operation. And why is that so important? Why did I go to such lengths to tell you about that? That gave the FBI, the government, the reason that they needed to bring in the full force of government and land on that little town in Burns, Oregon. They took over that whole town. They closed the airport that made them their headquarters. They closed the schools. They put up fencing with barbed wire around it. They tacked out with long guns throughout the town. They had people getting on Facebook and law enforcement telling individuals to carry a gun when you go to the grocery store because you don't know if you're going to be attacked. Ammon, Ryan, my husband Lavoy, and the few people who stood with them out at Malheur, they were 35 miles outside of town, out in the middle of the desert, out in the middle of nowhere. They were not a threat to anyone. They were out there exercising their First Amendment. They were out there exercising their Second Amendment to ensure their First Amendment. They wanted their voices heard. You will hear Ammon in, I think it's part 2 of Lavoy Dead Man Talking, telling the sheriff, I tried to do this. I tried to go through the proper channels, but you guys ignored me. You would not respond. This was our only remedy. So they completely took over that town and performed a psychological operation on the people in that town and the people of this country. The media was involved in the narrative and setting the tone for all of you. And what was part of that narrative? He was a white, racist, welfare cowboy, a domestic terrorist. I think we heard domestic terrorist over 27,000 times in those few days that my husband was up there. People believed that my husband was a domestic terrorist. They believed he was a racist. They believed that he was there to do harm. From what the media put in their minds. When people stop to watch the film and listen to Lavoy for themselves and they hear his words, that it resonates in their heart because he speaks about the Constitution, about liberty and freedom. He speaks about the individual right, not the collective. Sure, he'd be concerned about social issues, but didn't we used to, as a community, get together and solve those problems within our own communities? Didn't we used to do that? We weren't looking for a handout from the federal government for every little new program that we thought maybe would be great. We were actively engaged in our communities trying to fix the problems that we might have had. Another thing in that Wooten letter that came out that was very disturbing, and we got before the judge in my particular case, my lawsuit case that I have going on right now. It came out that the BLM law enforcement, it says here in the Wooten whistleblower letter, he reports that they needed an officer-involved shooting to make these types of people get the message, end quote. That was in the document just days before they killed my husband. So when they tell you that they were up there trying to get rid of domestic terrorists, what they're not telling you is that they set this whole thing up. I was there. I was there with my husband just the day before he was killed, a day and a half before. We had gone to town for breakfast after attending church in town. We weren't afraid to go in and out. There was nothing that made us afraid. There weren't roadblocks. Some of them went grocery shopping. Some of the men went in and out for haircuts. Ammon drove home every weekend to see his wife and family. My husband left one time and came all the way home down, and I live in Arizona. And we attended a meeting in Cedar City, Utah, with a bunch of ranchers. And then he drove all the way back to Oregon to continue his stand. There were obvious things to be afraid of, but coming and going wasn't one of them. They had been speaking with the sheriff, they had been speaking with the FBI, they had been speaking with law enforcement. You'll see this in the video. They shook their hands. The sheriff would say to you that he wasn't even afraid to speak with Ammon and Lavoy and Ryan. why an officer-involved shooting? Why was that necessary? To keep us all in line, to scare us back into our little caves, to frighten us, and it worked. Because believe you me, everybody ran for the hills. And I don't mean just from Malheur, because there were people who stayed and remained there for some time trying to hold their protest. But I'm talking about the support. Everybody was afraid for their own situation, right? And everybody was making judgments about what happened and whether Lavoy reached for a gun or not. Well, we have proof from those videos that we attended that trial of that agent, Astorita. We have proof from his trial that the gun was placed on my husband after his death. You can see it on video. You can see it in part 4. We have so much proof from that trial that there's so much. There was an FBI agent trainer of over 40 years who testified to the fact that multiple protocols on multiple levels had been violated during that kill stop. A trainer of the HRT team is testifying against the HRT team member. Do you think I'm going to get a chance to have all of the facts heard in a court of law? I'm fighting for that now. I'm fighting for that now. My lawsuit has gone forward. We just had an oral arguments hearing. That was quite an interesting experience, to sit in that courtroom again, where Ammon and Ryan and all of them were found not guilty, and to listen to the federal government's attorney, the women attorneys. They're changing their tactics a little, so this time we have women attorneys state their case, and of course they're labeling my husband again. They're labeling him a domestic terrorist. What's interesting to that is that he has not been found guilty of anything. He is not the one on trial here. I am suing the federal government for a wrongful death lawsuit, yet he is being labeled and tried and found guilty, even in oral arguments when there has never been a trial in his behalf, which my attorney had pointed out. So that is what we're fighting for in that regard. And even if this judge decides to dismiss this case, which he hinted to, we have the door that's been left open to go ahead and refile. And I will be doing that as well, because I feel that I need to see this thing through to the end. Even if I have to go to the Supreme Court or whatever court, I will exhaust every avenue. Because this isn't just about me getting a little bit of money, because that's the only remedy in a civil suit. That's all that remedy is. This isn't about that. That isn't the reason my husband went to Malheur. That isn't the reason he stood. That isn't the reason that I am on the road more than I'm at home taking care of business. It is about the individual. It is about our due process system. It is about preserving that for each and every single one of us, for our children. Because if I don't stand, then who's going to? They'll make this example for the next time. They're worried. They're worried. They lost 2 cases already. They do not want you, the American people, to hear the evidence that we have in another trial. They don't want that. Talk about wailing and gnashing of teeth. Because that's what I see happening in the court system. It's important that Trump is elected again. It is so important for the individual. He can relate to me now. You know, people used to come up to me, aren't you glad that President Trump is president? When he was first nominated, right, in 2016. I'm going, well, yes, I'm grateful, but I don't know that he can understand me or my situation at all. 4 years later. That's a whole different story, is it not? What has he been through? He's been through everything. He has been labeled a domestic terrorist, basically. He's been labeled a white supremacist. He's been labeled everything that Lavoy was labeled. He's had to put up with FISA court. He's had to put up with Comey. Oh my goodness, Comey was head of FBI and in charge of this operation the year my husband was killed. There are emails from Loretta Lynch under Obama and the governor of Oregon in matter to this case. President Trump does understand what I'm going through. He is living it. He can sympathize with me. What can he do for me? Not a whole lot. I'm not imprisoned. He pardoned the Hammonds. He gave them back their grazing rights. My husband's dead. He can't bring him back. He cannot do anything about the court. I have to walk this walk, and I have to fight this fight. I have to hold them accountable. But he can sympathize with me, and I know he had something to do with me getting my grazing rights back and my property back. Excuse me. It's not the virus. I read an article the other day that half of the BLM from the East Coast have quit. Aw. And I was kind of happy about that. Because one of the comments in Larry's 14-page whistleblowing letter was that the BLM Law Enforcement Division and the BLM officers and rangers are so far disconnected from the ranchers and farmers. They don't even understand us or our lifestyle or what we do. And so I was glad to hear that they quit. We need to hire people that will understand, that will want to work with the rancher and the farmer and the logger and the miner, the camper and the hunter, and not try to put us all. Hello? I urge you to continue to seek seek out the truth in this story. Like I said, 4 of these different elected officials are experiencing a great deal of attacks in reference to their good name and their standing. Representative Matt Shea in Washington, a Representative Heather Scott in Idaho, just to name a couple of the 2 that have been really fighting back. They're good Christian, moral people who are standing, and I hope that you will give them your support. As we sat at just last week, we were up in Portland, Oregon for the oral argument hearing in my wrongful death lawsuit case. And so we spent the day up there in a courtroom. Judge Sullivan was presiding, and we had the female attorneys for the BLM, for the state of Oregon, and for the FBI in particular. What was interesting there was just as we got through with the day and the arguments and what she was wrapping up, she was saying that we were going to go about 90 days, and then she would render her findings and recommendations. And then she turned to our family, and I had 6 of my family members, and Mark was with me on the front row bench. And she turned to us and she said, "Thank you for being so obedient through these proceedings." Obedient. I was like shocked. It was as if she was the parent and she was talking to her children, letting us know that we had done well. And I thought to myself, I was brought up well. I had good parents. They taught me how to behave. But I was insulted. I was insulted. Obedient. Yeah, exactly. So I will continue, even with that attitude from the judge, even though I know that she may dismiss it, but she said she would not dismiss it with prejudice. We will continue to refile and march forward with this trial, because I am determined to hold the FBI, the Oregon State Police, the BLM Law Enforcement Division accountable for the illegal activities that they did that day and many other days before. We have to. We have to. If they were in the private sector, wouldn't they have already lost their job? Right? No, they get full retirement if you work for the government, even if you commit crimes. This has got to stop. It's on our dime, people. So we will continue. I want to talk about a little something that's the 4-year anniversary. I went to Oregon, and I talked about all of the things that are hard and difficult and sad, and this was hard and it was difficult to go there, but they're lovely people in John Day, and they had a 3-day event planned for me, and we went out to the graveside and we sang Amazing Grace, and we laid some flowers where Lavoy was murdered, and a lot of lovely people hugged me and wished me well and urged me to continue. And it felt good to be there. And on my way back from where he was killed, I'm driving into John Day and heading to where I was sleeping that night. And all of a sudden, it goes from 55 to 35 or 25, I can't remember which. And then all of a sudden I see these lights behind me. I'm going, oh no. I'm getting pulled over in John Day. That's where my husband was headed the night he was killed, if some of you don't know the story. And I thought, oh no. And it was Lavoy's birthday. And I rolled down my window, and the officer comes up and he says, "My name is Deputy so-and-so. You're being recorded.
I went, okay. And he says, can I have your license and registration? And I said, well, this is a rental car, and I handed him my license. And he left. About 5 minutes later, he comes back to the car, and he hands me my license. And he says, by chance, are you related to Lavoy Finnecum? And I went, yes, I'm his wife. And he starts tearing up the ticket. He says he shouldn't have been killed. We don't all believe what happened that day was the right thing. I just want you to know that. I knew that there were good police officers. I keep saying that everywhere I go. I know that there are good men and women who serve in these positions. But they have to get a paycheck, and they have to support their families, and they have to get along to go along, or whatever that phrase is. Go along to get along. But he tore it up. And he shook my hand, and I thanked him, and he thanked me for Lavoy. There are good things that come from a loss. I've traveled the country, and I've met thousands of people who love America, who love my husband Lavoy, and for what he was standing for, because they knew that he was standing for them. I have lots of other things that I want to do. We're hopefully heading to Washington to speak to a group of people about label lynching, about reform, about domestic terrorism code. These are very important things. I urge you to get with Mark Herr in reference to some of these things and learn more about it. We have to not allow that domestic terrorist code to come to be, because some of the labels that would be in that lexicon would be Christian, Patriot, Constitutionalist. All of these good things, how did they get turned upside down, right? How did the definitions all of a sudden become so evil? I'm not quite sure how, but we've got to stand up and not allow this to happen. In our Declaration of Independence, it's very clear. It says, quote, "The purpose of government is to secure individual rights, that when government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it." I believe that that's what my husband was trying to do. He was trying to stand. And I wanted to read a quote from his book. His book is Only by Blood and Suffering, Regaining Lost Freedom. He wrote that before he died. His way of kind of teaching about individualism versus collectivism. In the beginning of the book, it says, "The fight for freedom is God's fight. When a man stands for freedom, he stands with God. And as long as he stands for freedom, he stands with God. And were he to stand alone, he would still stand with God. Any man will be eternally vindicated and rewarded for his stand for freedom." That was by Ezra Taft Benson. My husband quoted him often. He had that quote above his desk, and he remembered that. And when he talked to us in the videos, he says, stand up. Because when you stand, others will stand. God will stand with you. So I urge you today to stand. Stand like Lavoy did, and say no more. And he also said in one of his videos, he said, "It may not end well for me, but it will end well for liberty." So there is hope. People die when they stand for liberty and freedom. They have throughout time. I'm just grateful that you remember him and that he did not die for nothing. And I know that he will continue to have this effect on people as they get to know him for who he really was and not for the media's interpretation of who Lavoy was. I want to again thank you for having me here. Thank you for wanting to know more about my husband's story. Thank you for continuing to support me and my family as we take the government to task. May God be with you. May God bless America. Thank you.
We've been going for a while, so we're gonna take about a 10-minute break, let you guys do some jumping jacks and move around a little bit. At one of the tables back there, the deputies are here from the Tehama County Deputies Association, and go ahead and go back and talk to them a little bit, find out what's going on with their salary packages, and there's coffee in the back. So we'll draw the raffle ticket as soon as we start up again.